At 6:30 on March 1, 1943, Major Ed Larner stood on the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby, watching B-25 Mitchell bombers idle under low clouds that smelled of fuel, salt, and coming violence. The mission his crews were preparing for had already been written off by higher command as impossible. Larner was 31 years old. He had flown 72 combat missions. He had sunk 0 ships. That statistic haunted him. Japanese intelligence had failed for once. American codebreakers intercepted the departure of a massive convoy from Rabaul. 8 troop transports escorted by 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers bound for La. Every transport that reached New Guinea meant months of jungle fighting, more infantry assaults against dug-in positions, more men dying for ground measured in yards. The convoy had to be stopped at sea, but the problem was physics. For 8 months, 5th Air Force bombers had attacked Japanese shipping from high altitude. The results were dismal. A hit rate of barely 3%. Bombs fell beautifully, tight formations splashing the ocean in textbook patterns, while Japanese ships simply turned away and sailed on. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from 10,000 feet took 37 seconds to reach the water. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer at flank speed traveled nearly 400 yards. Bombardiers aimed at where the ship was. The bomb landed where the ship had been. Japanese captains learned quickly. They watched American bombers climb, calculated trajectories, adjusted course, and waited. By the time the bombs fell, the ships were already gone, and the sky was full of flak. Larner had watched his squadron bleed, trying to make high-altitude bombing work. For aircraft lost in the past month alone, 40 men gone. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had time to track every approach, walk their fire into the formations, and tear bombers apart before a single bomb struck water. Then General George Kenney proposed something that sounded insane. Fly in at 50 feet. Skip the bomb across the surface like a stone. Release at 300 yards with a 5-second delay fuse. Momentum would carry the bomb into the ship's hull. 1 skip, maybe 2, then detonation, at the waterline or just below it. On paper, it worked. In the air, it looked like suicide. A B-25 flying at mast height toward a destroyer meant charging straight into a wall of fire. 127mm naval guns, 25mm cannons, machine guns stitched across the deck. One lucky hit to an engine, and the bomber would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could react. Higher command banned the tactic. Twice. Reckless disregard for equipment and personnel, the official response said. Crews were ordered back to proven high-altitude bombing. But proven tactics weren't sinking ships. That morning, Larner walked into the operations tent and spread reconnaissance photographs across the table. The convoy was already steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea. 8 fat transports in 2 neat columns, destroyers pacing the flanks. Every ship was packed with troops, artillery, ammunition. If they reached La, the war in New Guinea would grind on for another year. Larner knew what he was about to ask his crews to do. It would either prove Kenney right, or get 60 American airmen killed before noon. The convoy would enter striking range at 9 o'clock. That gave Major Ed Larner 3 hours. 3 hours to prepare. 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly in a way bomber crews were never supposed to fly. Larner summoned his squadron leaders into the briefing tent and laid out a plan that had been officially forbidden. Not discouraged. Forbidden. The B-25 Mitchell was designed to bomb from medium altitude. Level flight. Predictable approaches. Bombardiers calculating drift and speed while gunners defended against interceptors. That was how bomber warfare was supposed to work. But predictability was killing them. At altitude, Japanese gunners had time. 30 seconds. Sometimes more. Enough to track the approach, lead the target, and fill the sky with steel. Enough to let ships turn away before the bombs ever reached the water. Kenney's modification was meant to remove that time. 5th Air Force mechanics had torn out the bombardier's nose and replaced it with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, for clustered in the nose, for mounted in blisters along the fuselage. The Mitchell was no longer a bomber. It was a gun platform, 200 rounds per second straight ahead. The theory was brutally simple. If the gunners were ducking, they weren't aiming. Suppress the deck. Suppress the bridges. Suppress the anti-aircraft crews long enough to get close. The modification added 1,200 pounds and shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. It made landings harder, takeoffs longer. But at 50 feet above the ocean, survivability depended on momentum, not elegance. They had practiced in secret. Kinney had found them a target. The Pruth, a rusting 4,700-ton steamer grounded on Nader Reef since 1924. Half-submerged. Forgotten. Perfect. The crews flew practice runs at dawn and dusk when no one was watching. They learned how the Mitchell handled at wave-top height, how fast the water rose in the windshield, how violently the aircraft responded to turbulence at 270 miles per hour. They learned what happened when you got it wrong. On February 16th, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett came in too high, 70 feet instead of 50. His bomb skipped twice, cleared the wreck entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond it. The lesson was immediate. Lower. Faster. Closer. On the next run, Fawcett came in at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the hull just below the waterline. Exactly where a real ship's magazines would be. Exactly where one bomb could tear a transport apart. But the Pruth didn't shoot back. Now the target would. Larner spread reconnaissance photographs across the table and pointed to the lead transport. 800 feet long, 10,000 tons displacement, capable of carrying 1,500 troops. The flagship of the convoy. Everyone in the tent understood what that meant. Japanese reinforcements had turned Buna into a 6-month nightmare that cost the Allies 5,000 casualties. Laos would be worse. Jungle, mountains, fortified ridges. Every transport that unloaded meant more men dying inland. Skip bombing required precision bomber crews were never trained for. Approach altitude, 50 feet. Approach speed, 270 miles per hour. Release point, 300 yards. Trajectory angle, 8 degrees. Fuse delay, 5 seconds. Miss any one variable, and the bomb would skip over the ship, sink without detonating, or explode short and do nothing. Larner assigned targets deliberately. Transport 1 through Transport 8. Destroyers only if the transports were already burning. No aircraft would attack the same ship twice. One pass, one bomb, one chance. At 7 o'clock, the crews walked to their aircraft. 9 B-25s, 54 men. Ahead of them, 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters would strafe first, raking the decks and gun positions. Above them, 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would bomb from altitude, forcing evasive maneuvers and breaking formation. P-38 Lightnings would keep Japanese fighters high, but the killing blow would come at 50 feet. Larner climbed into his aircraft at 7:15. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, worked the checklist. Bombardier Staff Sergeant Carl Walls checked the release mechanism again. Then again. No one spoke. They had flown together for 9 months. They all knew what a 50-foot approach meant. They all understood the odds. Larner started the port engine. Then the starboard. The mission clock was running. The right cyclone engines caught and settled into their familiar roar. Across the runway, 8 more B-25s wound up one by one, propellers blurring into silver discs against the rain-darkened coral. The formation would depart in flights of 3. Larner's aircraft first. Once airborne, they would stay low, no climbing, no weaving. Below 100 feet, Japanese radar was blind. Surprise was not an advantage. It was the only one they had. At 7:45, Larner released the brakes. The Mitchell surged forward, tail lifting, wheels skimming the coral before the aircraft clawed into the air. One by one, the other bombers followed, dropping down toward the ocean instead of climbing away from it. By 9:30, he would know whether Kinney's theory worked, or whether he had led his squadron into a slaughter. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. Larner held his aircraft at 30 feet above the water, low enough that spray from the wave tops flecked the windscreen. The B-25s flew in a loose V, each aircraft spaced 200 yards apart, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough that a single burst of flak couldn't take down more than one bomber. Radio silence. Japanese intelligence monitored every frequency. One careless transmission would warn the convoy long before the Americans arrived. Coordination could wait. Surprise could not. At 8:30, the ocean below remained empty. At this altitude, Larner's world extended barely 5 miles in any direction. No horizon cues. No landmarks. Just water and sky. His navigation had to be perfect. 5 degrees off course, and they would miss the convoy entirely. Approach from the wrong angle, and the destroyers would have time to bring their main guns to bear. At 8:52, he saw smoke on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust. Thick. Rising straight into the air. 16 ships. As they closed, the convoy resolved into 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. Destroyers screened ahead and along both flanks, their wakes cutting sharp, white lines across the sea. Larner tapped his throat microphone once, a single click. Titan formation acknowledged with matching clicks. Radio discipline held. At 8:57, the Australian bowfighters went in. From 3 miles out, Larner watched 13 aircraft dive on the convoy from the northeast, their 20mm cannons raking the destroyer decks. Tracers stitched across steel and water. Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung hard toward the new threat. Exactly as planned. The Australians weren't there to sink ships. They were there to make gunners look the wrong way. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived overhead at 10,000 feet. Bomb bay doors opened. Bombs fell. Japanese captains threw their helms hard over, breaking formation. Columns scattered. Destroyers accelerated to flank speed, their sterns churning white water. Confusion spread across the convoy. Perfect. Larner pulled back on the throttles and dropped lower. 40 feet. Airspeed, 260 miles per hour. Staff Sergeant Carl Walls began calling ranges. 4,000 yards. 3,800. 3,600. Every ship was now clearly visible. Larner selected his target, the second transport in the port column, 700 feet long, riding low in the water. Fully loaded. His bomb would strike amidships, where troop compartments were packed shoulder to shoulder. A destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Muzzle flashes bloomed. The first shells arced high, passing harmlessly overhead. The Japanese gunners were still calculating for altitude bombers. They hadn't adjusted for an attack skimming the waves. At 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. All 8. 50 caliber machine guns hammered forward. Tracers tore across the destroyer's deck, walking up gun mounts and into the bridge. Crewmen scattered. Weapons fell silent or swung wildly. The Mitchell hurtled straight toward the transport, wave tops blurring beneath the nose. Wall's voice was steady. 800. 600. 400. The distance closed faster than instinct said it should. Larner held the aircraft level. Any climb would ruin the trajectory. Any dip would bury the bomb in the sea. The transport filled the windscreen. Tracers walked across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered. Steel sparked. Men on deck dropped flat or threw themselves over railings. The suppression was working. Anti-aircraft crews couldn't return fire while half-inch bullets were tearing through their gun positions at 800 rounds per minute. 1,200 yards. Larner saw his wingmen peeling away, each bomber sliding laterally to line up on its assigned ship. The formation wasn't breaking down. It was dissolving exactly as planned. 9 bombers. 9 targets. Simultaneous strikes. No time for the Japanese to shift fire. No time to coordinate. At 800 yards, the destroyer's main guns fired again. This time the shells bracketed Larner's aircraft, one short, one long. The concussion rocked the Mitchell. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage. Ben, the co-pilot, glanced at the gauges. Port engine oil pressure dropping. Still in the green. 600 yards. The transport filled the windscreen. Larner could see individual soldiers on deck. Helmets flashing, bodies scrambling. Men trying to reach gun mounts that were already shredded by machine gun fire. He could see the bridge windows, the gun crews swinging their weapons toward him. Every instinct screamed to pull up. 400 yards. Wall's voice cut clean through the engine roar. Bomb armed. Ready. 300 yards. Larner pressed the release. The aircraft jumped as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped free. It struck the water nose first, skipped once like a flat stone, and arrowed straight toward the hull. Larner hauled back on the yoke. The 5-second fuse was counting down. He didn't see the explosion. He felt it. The shock wave slammed into the Mitchell, lifting the tail and throwing the aircraft sideways. Ben wrestled the controls. The altimeter spun past 100 feet, then 2, then 3. Larner risked a glance back. The transport was tearing itself apart. A column of fire and black smoke erupted amidships. Steel buckled outward. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition cooked off. The ship listed hard to port, water pouring through a hole large enough to swallow a truck. Men were jumping, dozens of them, tiny figures abandoning a ship that was already dying. One bomb, 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. Skip bombing worked. To Liner's right, Jake Fawcett's B-25 was clawing skyward from its own attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Bill Hayes had released on a destroyer. His bomb skipped twice and struck below the aft turret. The internal explosion lifted the destroyer's stern clean out of the water. When it slammed back down, the rear third of the ship was gone. The vessel began settling almost immediately, for targets hit in 90 seconds. But the defenders were adapting. On the far flank, noticing the pattern, a destroyer turned directly toward the attackers. Its main guns fired in rapid succession. Shells walked across the water toward Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards. The second by 20. The third hit. The bomber disintegrated. The bomb beneath the fuselage detonated on impact. The explosion erased the aircraft completely. No parachutes. No debris large enough to identify. 5 men gone between one heartbeat and the next. Liner saw the fragments scatter across the sea. There was no time to process it. The attack was still unfolding. The remaining B-25s pressed in. Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport, the Convoy flagship. His approach was perfect. 50 feet, 270 miles per hour. Machine guns blazing. The Japanese fired back with everything they had, 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air between aircraft and ship was solid with tracers. Johnson released. The bomb skipped once and punched through the hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse carried it deep inside before detonation. The explosion tore through 3 decks. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. Liner knew what was down there: artillery shells, fuel drums, ammunition stacked for an entire regiment. The ship became an inferno. Men burned on deck. Others leapt into the sea, trailing smoke. Paul Warren's bomber took hits on approach. A gunner had finally adjusted for the low-altitude attack. 20mm shells ripped through Warren's port wing. Fuel streamed from the punctured tank. Warren didn't break off. 300 yards. 200. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped once and struck the transport just below the waterline. Warren banked hard to starboard, the bomber trailing fire. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, was already activating the fire suppression system. Foam flooded the engine compartment. The flames collapsed into smoke. The aircraft stayed airborne, barely. 6 transports were burning or sinking. 2 destroyers were crippled. 1 B-25 was gone. The entire first attack had lasted 4 minutes. Then the second wave arrived. 9 more B-25s from the 90th Bomb Squadron swept in from the west, led by Major Ralph Chell. They had watched Liner's attack from 5 miles out. They had seen ships split open, fires bloom, men abandoning decks. They also knew the cost. Chell's formation spread immediately, each bomber selecting a target still afloat. There was no need for coordination now. The convoy was already a wreck. This time, the Japanese were ready. Every gun in the formation was trained low. Destroyers formed a defensive line, their main batteries firing in coordinated volleys. The sea erupted with shell splashes, towering columns of white water rising around the incoming aircraft. This barrage wasn't frantic. It was measured, corrected, deadly. The Japanese had learned in 4 minutes. Chell came in from the east, straight out of the sun. The glare blinded gunners just long enough. His bomb struck a transport already listing from earlier damage. The explosion accelerated the inevitable. The ship rolled onto its side and sank in less than 2 minutes. Over 1,000 men went down with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as fortunate. His approach was wrong, too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up and began a wide turn for another pass. The destroyer he'd missed never lost sight of him. As Jensen rolled back in, the guns were waiting. The first shell tore off the port engine. The second hit the cockpit. The B-25 rolled inverted and struck the ocean at 300 miles per hour. There was no explosion, just impact. The sea closed over it and moved on. 2 bombers down. 7 transports sinking or sunk. 3 destroyers crippled. 8 minutes into the attack, Liner realized something with cold clarity. The Japanese still had fighters. At 9:15, they appeared. 18 Zeros dropped out of the cloud layer from 12,000 feet, silver shapes accelerating downward like birds of prey. Liner saw them first, tiny at altitude, then suddenly enormous. The P-38 Lightnings were supposed to hold them. Something had gone wrong. Either the Lightnings were outnumbered, or the Japanese had committed a second fighter group no one had anticipated. Liner's B-25 was vulnerable, low on fuel, low on ammunition. The nose guns had maybe 200 rounds left. Not enough for sustained defense. He pushed the throttles forward and dove. 50 feet. 30. 20. The propellers whipped salt spray into the windscreen. The Zeros split into two elements. Half climbed to engage the P-38s. The other 9 came straight for the bombers. They closed fast, firing their 20mm cannons from long range. Tracers slashed past Liner's canopy. Too close. He jinked left, then right, never flying straight long enough to be tracked. In the dorsal turret, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake fired short bursts at the nearest Zero. The fighter broke off, undamaged, but cautious. Warren's damaged bomber didn't have that luxury. A Zero latched onto his tail and stayed there. Warren tried everything: shallow dives, climbing turns, violent banks that strained the wounded wing. Nothing shook the attacker. The Japanese pilot waited, patient. When Warren lost airspeed at the top of a climbing turn, the Zero fired a short burst. The starboard engine exploded. The bomber rolled nose down and struck the sea. Liner saw parachutes, 3 of them, 3 out of 5. The Zeros pressed the attack for 6 minutes. Then, just as abruptly, they disengaged and climbed. Liner didn't understand why until he looked up. The B-17s were returning. At 10,000 feet, they came back over the convoy, bomb bay doors open. The Japanese pilots had a choice: continue hunting bombers at wave height or defend what remained of the convoy from above. They chose above, and in that choice, the battle was decided. The heavy bombers were the greater threat now. Liner used the brief window to assess his own situation. The port engine was running rough. Oil pressure fluctuated between acceptable and alarming. Fuel showed 60%, enough to reach Port Moresby if nothing else went wrong. Nothing else ever went wrong in combat. He glanced back at the convoy. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were either sinking or already gone. The 8th was still afloat but burning, its superstructure blackened, trying to limp west toward the New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screening line were damaged. 2 were dead in the water. The other 2 circled the wrecks, lowering boats, pulling survivors from the sea. It was 9:21. The initial attack had lasted 11 minutes. The killing would last 3 days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt the waterline at night. Aircraft would strafe lifeboats by day. The Japanese had committed nearly 7,000 troops to the convoy. Fewer than 1,200 would ever reach La. The rest would burn, drown, or die under the sun. Liner set course for home. His formation was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers were confirmed lost. 20 men were dead or missing. The mission had worked, but the price was already written. Skip bombing had proven itself, not in theory, not in tests, but against steel hulls and living men. Within months, the tactic would be standardized, taught, refined. Japanese commanders would abandon large surface convoys within range of Allied air power. The supply lines to New Guinea would wither. The war would turn. Liner didn't know any of that. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, his engine was failing, and Port Moresby was still 90 minutes away. He ordered the crew to dump everything non-essential. Ammunition they wouldn't fire. Spare tools. Equipment crates. Anything that added weight. The B-25 struggled to maintain altitude, the port engine vibrating harder with every minute. At 10:10, Ben spotted land. The southern coast of New Guinea. Barely. The port engine was shaking violently now. Oil streamed from a fracture in the housing. Temperature climbed into the red. 5 more minutes, and it would seize. Liner feathered the propeller and transferred all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed. Just enough. The coastline crept closer. 40 miles. 30. 20. The engine held. Liner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was lined with mechanics, intelligence officers, ground crews. Word had already spread. Something big had happened out over the Bismarck Sea. He cut the engines and sat motionless in the cockpit, hands still wrapped around the control yoke. 30 seconds passed. Neither man spoke. They had been airborne 3 hours and 42 minutes. It felt like 3 days. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Larner and the surviving pilots sat under canvas while intelligence officers asked the same questions in different orders. How many ships hit? How many sinking? Bombs released. Aircraft lost. Fragments assembled into truth. 9 aircraft had attacked. 5 returned. Mitchell gone. Jensen gone. Warren in the water, rescued by a Catalina. 2 wounded. At 1300 hours, the reconnaissance photos arrived. An Australian Beaufort had photographed the convoy from 15,000 feet at noon. The images said what words couldn't. 8 transports. 7 destroyed or sinking. 1 beached on the New Britain coast, still burning. For destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 crippled, and withdrawing toward Rabaul. Total time from first attack to final strikes, 3 hours. General George Kinney arrived at Port Moresby at 1600 hours. He went straight to the operations tent, spread the photos on the table, and studied them in silence. He didn't congratulate anyone, didn't shake hands. He pointed at the burning transport on the coastline. Finish it. The Australian Beaufighters would go again at dusk. Nothing could be allowed to reach Ladd. Nothing. The second strike launched at 1730. Larner didn't fly. His aircraft needed a new engine. He stood on the runway instead, watching 9 fresh B-25s lift into the setting sun, heading back toward the smoke. They would be over the target at dusk. Japanese survivors were already ashore, dragging what they could from the beached transport, crates, rifles, wounded men, assuming the danger had passed. It hadn't. The strike returned at 2000 hours. The transport was gone. It had sunk at its mooring sometime during the afternoon, settling into the shallows, still burning as the tide came in. The 2 damaged destroyers had been caught trying to withdraw. Both were hit. Both were sinking by nightfall. The Japanese had begun the operation with 16 ships. By the night of March 2nd, 14 lay on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers limped into Rabaul just before midnight, barely afloat. The human cost was catastrophic. Nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers had embarked at Rabaul. Reconnaissance flights over the next 2 days counted fewer than 900 reaching the New Britain coast, some by lifeboat, some swimming, some clinging to wreckage. American PT boats intercepted most of the boats. Some survivors were rescued. Others were killed in the water. Over those 3 days, the line between combat and massacre dissolved. Orders were explicit. No quarter. Japanese aircraft had machine-gunned American aircrews in parachutes earlier in the campaign. The Americans returned the favor, to soldiers in the water, to lifeboats, to men crawling onto beaches. Larner learned about it 3 days later. He didn't ask for details. Didn't want to know which PT crews had fired, which bomber crews had strafed swimmers, which decisions had been made in seconds and would never be written down. War had rules until it didn't. The rules had stopped applying somewhere between Mitchell's bomber disintegrating and the last transport sliding under the surface. Nobody talked about it. Nobody recorded it. It happened anyway. The final figures arrived on March 7th. Japanese losses. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,000 troops drowned. Another 1,500 killed by air attack. Roughly 1,200 reached Ladd, without weapons, without supplies, without cohesion. They were combat ineffective on arrival. The reinforcement operation had failed completely. American losses. For B-25s, 1 B-17, 2 P-38s, 13 aircrew killed, 6 wounded. Against an entire convoy, the exchange rate was brutally one-sided. Skip bombing had worked, but it worked only because Larner's crews had flown straight at destroyers at 50 feet while the air turned into metal. Courage didn't quite describe it. Insanity was closer. Kinney later called it the most decisive air-sea battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto called it a disaster. The Imperial Japanese Navy immediately canceled all future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. The supply line to New Guinea was effectively severed. Garrisons at Ladd, Salamaua, and Madon would survive only on what they already had. They would not survive long. But the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed more than Japanese strategy. It changed how the world attacked ships. Skip bombing was refined, standardized, taught. The British adopted it. The Soviets copied it. By 1944, low-altitude maritime strike had become global doctrine. Larner flew 16 more missions before rotating home in May. He never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir, never spoke publicly about the battle. He had done what was required. That was enough. But one question remained unanswered. Would the tactic work against an enemy who was ready for it? The Japanese tested that question 3 months later. On June 3, 1943, American reconnaissance spotted another convoy forming at Rabaul. 6 transports, 8 destroyers. This time they sailed at night. This time they had continuous zero fighter cover. This time every destroyer carried additional 20mm guns specifically positioned for low-altitude defense. They had learned from the Bismarck Sea. They had adapted. At dawn, 5th Air Force attacked again. 12 B-25s. Same tactic. Same altitude. This time, the results would be very different. The results were different. 2 transports hit. 1 destroyer damaged. 3 B-25s shot down. The exchange rate had shifted. The Japanese had learned. Gunners who survived the Bismarck Sea trained their replacements differently. They stopped looking up. They tracked low. They fired early. They concentrated everything they had during the final seconds of approach. The moment when a bomber was committed, when it couldn't jink, couldn't climb, couldn't escape without dropping its weapon. That was where skip bombing was most vulnerable. The Americans adapted in return. By July, 5th Air Force mechanics added armor around cockpits and engines. Extra steel plates. Crude but effective. Forward-firing armament increased dramatically. 12. 50 caliber machine guns became standard. Some aircraft carried 14. The theory stayed the same. Suppress the guns. Force the gunners to choose between returning fire and surviving. Overwhelm them long enough to deliver the bomb. The modifications worked. On November 2, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor in the largest skip bombing raid of the war. 18 warships lay inside the harbor. 30 vessels were hit. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. 1 destroyer sunk. 2 auxiliary ships destroyed. 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. The entire raid lasted 18 minutes. American losses, 2 B-25s. Rabaul proved something else. Skip bombing worked best in confined waters. Against ships that couldn't maneuver, couldn't scatter, couldn't run. Against anchored fleets, narrow straits, crowded harbors, it was devastating. Against convoys in open ocean, with room to maneuver and fighters overhead, it was lethal to both sides. The British adopted the technique late in 1943. RAF strike aircraft used it against German convoys off Norway. The results mirrored the Pacific. High success, high losses. The Germans responded by bristling merchant ships with anti-aircraft guns and demanding heavy fighter escort. The cost of moving supplies rose sharply. Efficiency fell. The Soviets used skip bombing in the Black Sea and Baltic. Their approach was cruder, lower altitude, heavier bombs, less suppressive fire. Courage wasn't the problem. Refinement was. Some ships were sunk. Many bombers were lost. By 1944, skip bombing had evolved into a system rather than a stunt. High-altitude bombers attacked first to force maneuver. Fighters strafed to suppress guns. Skip bombers came last, low, fast, precise, striking when defenses were already overloaded. Losses fell. Effectiveness remained. The numbers told the story. Between March 1943 and August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or severely damaged 212 Japanese vessels. 47 bombers were lost. Roughly 4.5 ships per bomber. High-altitude bombing achieved less than 1 ship for every 3 bombers lost. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective. The human cost was harder to measure. Skip bombing required crews to fly directly at ships bristling with weapons, holding steady while tracers filled the air, knowing there would be no second chance if anything went wrong. The psychological strain was extreme. Crews flying skip bombing missions had shorter combat tours, higher fatigue rates, more medical groundings, more men who simply couldn't do it again. The tactic worked. It also broke people. Larner never flew skip bombing again after May 1943. He trained others instead. Watched them take off. Watched some of them not come back. By the end of the war, he had trained 62 pilots in the technique. 18 were killed. 23 were wounded. A fatality rate just under 30%. Better than high-altitude bombing. worse than almost any other aviation role. Historians would argue for decades whether skip bombing shortened the war, whether the ships sunk, the convoy stopped, the garrisons starved justified the cost. But the men who flew it never debated the theory. They knew the answer had been paid for in seconds, 50 feet above the water, flying straight at a wall of guns, counting down the distance to 300 yards. That was the price. And they paid it. The answer was complicated. Skip bombing didn't win wars by itself. It didn't capture islands or force surrenders. What it did was make reinforcement ruinously expensive. It strangled supply lines. It forced the Japanese Navy to abandon large-scale convoy operations entirely. Without supplies, garrisons weakened. Without reinforcements, defensive positions collapsed. Islands didn't fall in dramatic battles. They starved, one by one. That much was undeniable. What was equally certain was this. On March 2nd and 3rd, 1943, 9B, 25 bombers flying at 50 feet destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in 15 minutes of sustained combat. The tactic had been banned twice, called suicidal by every pilot who heard it, rejected by higher command as reckless and unproven. It worked only because the men flying it accepted something worse than the risk, the certainty that if they failed, 7,000 enemy soldiers would reach their destination and prolong the war by months. The bombers that attacked the Bismarck Sea convoy didn't survive the war. None were preserved. None displayed in museums. They were flown until worn out, then scrapped for metal. Major Ed Larner returned to the United States in June 1943. He was 31 years old. 88 combat missions. Longer survival than most Pacific bomber pilots. The Army Air Forces wanted him to train new crews, to formalize the tactic, refine it, pass on what he'd learned. He refused. Larner requested a transfer to transport aircraft. It was granted. For the rest of the war, he flew C-47s, cargo, personnel, supply runs across the Pacific. No combat. No skip bombing. No more missions where he watched crews he'd trained die in aircraft he'd taught them to fly. He never explained the decision. He didn't need to. Command understood. Some men could keep flying combat after what they'd seen. Others couldn't. Neither choice carried shame. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943. He declined the promotion twice before accepting it. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to finish the war and go home. He did. Japan surrendered in September 1945. Larner mustered out 3 months later with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds he'd never mentioned in any after-action report. He died in 1997 in Sacramento, California, 85 years old. His obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence. It did not mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It did not mention skip bombing. It did not mention that he helped prove a tactic that reshaped naval warfare. He had asked his family not to discuss it. They honored that request. General George Kenney received credit in most historical accounts. That suited Larner. Kenney had conceived the theory. Larner had simply flown straight at destroyers at 50 feet and proved it worked. That was enough. The distinction mattered to historians. It didn't matter to the pilots. They knew who led the first attack. They knew who trained them. They knew whose techniques kept them alive when Japanese gunners were tracking them at 50 feet and there was no room left to improvise. The B-25 Mitchell became legendary partly because of skip bombing. It flew in every theater of World War II, but its reputation was built in the Pacific, flying missions that shouldn't have been survivable. By war's end, B-25s had sunk more enemy shipping than any other bomber type. The technique Larner and his crews proved in March 1943 became standard doctrine for every B-25 unit in the Pacific. It was written into training manuals, drilled into new crews, refined through repetition and loss. No museum displays a B-25 flown at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Those aircraft were worn out, engines overstressed, airframes cracked. Many were flown until they couldn't be repaired, then stripped for aluminum and discarded. A few B-25s survive today in museums, restored, polished, static, or airworthy. The National Museum of the United States Air Force has one. The Smithsonian has another. Neither flew over the Bismarck Sea. They represent the crews who did. The battle itself is largely forgotten outside military history circles. It lacks the recognition of Midway or Guadalcanal. No major films were made about it. No iconic photographs captured the moment. What remains are after-action reports, reconnaissance photographs, and the testimony of men who mostly chose not to talk about what they'd done. And this, in March 1943, American bomber crews proved that aircraft could sink ships by skipping bombs across water at 50 feet. The tactic was called suicide before it worked. It was called genius afterward. The truth was somewhere between. It was desperation meeting innovation. Men trying something untested because the tested methods were failing. Courage measured not in aggression, but in holding a straight course while the air ahead turned lethal. The Pacific War changed after the Bismarck Sea. Japanese convoys stopped sailing within range of Allied land-based air power. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons weakened. Islands fell not because they were stormed, but because they could no longer be sustained. Skip bombing did not win the war by itself, but it closed a supply route the Japanese Navy needed to keep fighting. And once that route was gone, the end became inevitable.